San Diego, with its golden beaches, perfect weather, and bustling city life, is often considered one of the jewels of the West Coast. Tourists flock to the shores, eager to enjoy the sunlight, the waves, and the endless opportunities for fun. But beneath this sunny exterior lies a dark, hidden secret that not many people know about, and fewer still want to discuss. A secret so terrifying that it has haunted the city for decades. It all begins beneath the city's surface, where miles of tunnels stretch like veins under the skin of San Diego. These tunnels, often hidden from the public eye, are remnants of a time long past, a time when the city was in its infancy. The story goes that these tunnels were initially built in the early 1900s, when San Diego was still growing rapidly, and the world was on the brink of a war that would change everything. The city's leaders, worried about potential disasters or attacks, ordered the construction of these tunnels as emergency escape routes. These underground passages would allow the city's elite to escape in case of a natural disaster, an invasion, or even a civil war. But not all of the tunnels were built for escape. Some, it seems, were designed for something far darker. Over the years, rumors began to spread about what really took place in the depths of these tunnels. People whispered about the strange rituals, the eerie sounds that emanated from deep within, and the unsettling disappearances of those who ventured too close. The rumors started small. At first, they were nothing more than hushed conversations between old-timers in local bars. But over time, they became more vivid and terrifying. Those brave or foolish enough to explore the tunnels never returned. The locals started to say that those who ventured underground didn't just get lost. They were taken. The tunnels seemed to have a life of their own, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic and reason. No one could understand it. No one could explain it. And so the legend grew. The people who vanished weren't just lost. They were lost to something far darker, something evil that lurked in the shadows below. The whispers spread further, reaching the ears of anyone who dared to listen. San Diego's last scream, they called it, a name born from the tragic disappearances and the chilling sounds that echoed from the tunnels in the dead of night. It was said that if you listened closely enough, you could hear the distant screams of those who had vanished, forever trapped in the dark, never to be seen again. Over time, the stories became more elaborate. Some said that the tunnels were haunted by the spirits of those who had died down there, victims of long-forgotten crimes. Others claimed the tunnels were cursed, a place where something ancient and evil waited for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too close. No matter what the truth was, one thing became clear. As the years passed, the city tried to move on, trying to bury the fear and mystery that surrounded the tunnels. Authorities and city officials denied any connection to the sinister stories, insisting that the tunnels were just old, abandoned structures with no real significance. But the locals knew better. They had heard the tales. They had heard the screams. And for those who still remembered the lost souls of the tunnels, the truth was undeniable. But as much as the city tried to suppress it, there were always a few who were curious. The adventurers, the thrill seekers, the ones who believed they could outsmart the darkness. Some were even brave enough to venture into the tunnels, armed with nothing but flashlights and an unshakable desire to uncover the truth. But no one ever came back the same. One of the most famous incidents occurred in the late 80s, when a group of college students decided to explore the tunnels as part of a dare. They entered one of the entrances near downtown San Diego, determined to prove that the stories were just that, stories. At first, everything seemed normal. The tunnels were dark and damp, but they were nothing more than a network of... The group froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. "Is anyone there?" One of the students called out, his voice trembling. But there was no answer. The whispering stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural growl. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating through the walls of the tunnels. Panicked, the students turned to leave, but the tunnel behind them had disappeared. It was as if the earth itself had shifted, closing off their path. One by one, the group members were separated. They tried to scream for help, but their voices were swallowed by the tunnel's walls. Their cries echoed in the darkness, becoming more desperate as they tried to find their way out. But the deeper they went, the further they seemed to get from safety. The students never made it back. The authorities conducted an extensive search, but there was no sign of the group. No evidence of where they had gone or what had happened to them. Some said the group had been taken by the entity that haunted the tunnels, while others believed they had simply gotten lost and perished in the cold, dark labyrinth. Whatever the truth was, it added another chilling chapter to the legend of San Diego's last scream. To this day, the tunnels remain a place of mystery and fear. No one knows how far they go or what lies at the deepest depths. Some say the killer who lurks there is not human, but something much older and far more dangerous. Others believe it is the spirits of those who were trapped and died, forever cursed to wander the tunnels in search of new victims. The truth is, no one really knows what happens down there. But one thing is certain. Those who go searching for the truth rarely come back. They disappear, their screams echoing through the tunnels, joining the others who are lost forever in the dark. And so the urban legend continues, with no end in sight. San Diego's last scream is a story that haunts the city, a terrifying reminder of the dark secrets that lie just beneath the surface, waiting to claim the next soul brave enough or foolish enough to venture too close. It's a tale that will continue to be told, whispered in the dark, as long as the tunnels remain, and as long as there are those who are curious enough to explore them. But remember, once you enter the tunnels, there's no turning back. The killer who lurks in the darkness will be waiting. And if you're not careful, you might. It was an ordinary evening when Jessie Thompson, a quiet but curious college student, decided to embark on an adventure that would forever alter the course of her life and the lives of those around her. Jessie had always been an unassuming figure on campus, just another face in the crowd. She wasn't the most outgoing, but she wasn't a stranger either. She had a small group of close friends who knew her well, and they admired her inquisitive nature. But even they couldn't have predicted what Jessie would do one fateful evening. It all began with a simple class project. Jessie, a student in anthropology, was asked to research and present on the historical significance of San Diego's underground tunnels. The project was meant to be a routine exploration, one that would involve a few hours of research, interviews with historians, and perhaps a trip to the city's archives. But Jessie had always been drawn to the unknown. She had heard the whispered stories about the tunnels, the dark tales that circulated among locals, those hushed conversations about things that were never meant to be discovered. There was something about the stories that intrigued her, the mystery, the thrill of the unknown. So, on the night of her project, Jessie decided to go a step further. She wasn't content with just learning about the tunnels from books and old newspaper clippings. No, she wanted to experience them firsthand. Armed with only a flashlight, a notebook, and a camera, Jessie ventured into the tunnels beneath the city of San Diego, determined to uncover the truth behind the legends. The city had long since abandoned the tunnels. They were relics of a bygone era, originally constructed during the late 1800s as an underground network for smuggling, then later used as emergency escape routes during wartime. Over the years, they fell into disrepair, with only the bravest, most curious people ever daring to explore them. Jessie's friends weren't surprised when she told them about her plans to explore the tunnels. They knew Jessie was always seeking answers, always looking for something deeper. But they were also cautious, and a few tried to talk her out of it. "It's not safe down there," they warned. "People have gone missing." But Jessie brushed it off. She wasn't afraid of a few old stories. She was a determined, brave student with a thirst for knowledge, and she was convinced that nothing could happen to her. That night, she made her way to one of the known entrances to the tunnels near the outskirts of downtown San Diego. The city was quieter than usual, with only the occasional car passing by in the distance. Jessie paused at the entrance, a sense of anticipation tingling in the air. She could hear the faint hum of the city above, but below, the world was silent, eerily so. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the darkness, the cold stone of the tunnel walls closing in around her as she descended into the depths. As Jessie walked further into the tunnels, the air grew thicker. The silence was oppressive, almost suffocating. Her flashlight flickered occasionally, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. She kept going, her footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness her mind racing with both excitement and unease. She snapped pictures along the way, capturing images of the damp walls, the rusted pipes that lined the ceiling, and the strange markings that covered the floor. There were odd symbols, like old graffiti, scrawled in places she couldn't quite understand. Her heart quickened with every step, but she pressed on. Then, something shifted. It was subtle at first, an odd noise, the creak of old beams shifting in the darkness. Jessie froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She looked around, but the beam of her flashlight illuminated nothing but darkness. She tried to convince herself it was just the sound of the old structure settling. She had read about the tunnels, and she knew they were old and decaying. But the further she went, the more unsettling the silence became. The air grew colder. The shadows seemed to deepen. Jessie checked her watch. It was nearly midnight. She knew she should head back, but the sense of mystery was too strong to resist. She pressed forward, her mind fixed on the idea of uncovering the truth. She had heard the rumors, of course, the stories about the people who vanished, the chilling whispers that echoed in the tunnels, the screams that could be heard on the darkest of nights. But those were just stories, right? Nothing more than folklore, meant to frighten the curious. But as Jessie ventured deeper into the darkness, she began to doubt herself. The further she walked, the more the sounds around her seemed to change. What was once a quiet, abandoned place now seemed alive with a presence she couldn't explain. She heard faint whispers, too soft to understand, but enough to make her heart race. She could have sworn she felt someone or something just behind her. Suddenly, the light from her flashlight flickered and went out completely. Jessie cursed under her breath, fumbling for the spare batteries in her bag. As she replaced them, she heard a loud, shuffling noise behind her. It wasn't just the wind. No, it was something else. Something moving, something following her. Jessie's breath caught in her throat. The hairs on her neck stood up as she turned around, but there was nothing. Just the endless tunnel stretching before her, empty and silent. She shook her head, trying to push the fear down. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself, though her voice trembled slightly. "Just my mind playing tricks." But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her friend, Mark. "Jessie, where are you? You've been gone for hours. Call me." She quickly typed a response. "I'm fine, just exploring. I'll be out soon." But when Jessie looked at the message, a chilling realization hit her. It was the middle of the night. The tunnel was silent, yet something felt off, almost as if she wasn't alone anymore. That was the last anyone heard from her. The next morning, when Jessie's friends realized she hadn't come back, they called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. They assumed she had lost track of time or gotten caught up in her adventure. But as hours passed, the worry began to set in. Her friends went to the police, but they were initially dismissed. "People go missing all the time," the officers said. "She's probably just lost or decided to stay out later than planned." But as the day turned into night, And there was still no sign of Jessie. The urgency grew. Jessie's disappearance was unlike any other. There was no note, no explanation, nothing but the faintest clue, a torn piece of her jacket found near the entrance of the tunnel. The police launched a search, but it yielded nothing. No traces of her, no footprints, no signs of where she had gone. The search parties were baffled. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. And then, that night, the screams began again. They were faint at first, nothing more than a whisper on the wind, but they grew louder. The city, already on edge from Jessie's disappearance, was now haunted by those screams. People claimed to hear them late at night, coming from the direction of the tunnels. And those who dared venture close enough to listen swore they could hear Jessie's voice, calling out for help, her voice growing fainter with each passing day. It wasn't long before people began to put the pieces together. Jessie wasn't the first to disappear in those tunnels. She wouldn't be the last. The legend of San Diego's last scream had come alive once again. And this time, it was more than just an urban legend. It was a warning. Something lurked in those tunnels, and it was waiting for the next person to stumble upon its dark, deadly domain. Sarah had always been Jessie's closest friend. They shared everything, from their deepest secrets to their wildest dreams. When Jessie had disappeared, Sarah felt a deep, gnawing emptiness. It wasn't just that her best friend was missing. It was the way Jessie had vanished, the way the tunnels had swallowed her whole. No trace, no explanation, just a torn jacket and some eerie whispers that haunted the streets of San Diego. As the days passed and the police grew less and less concerned, Sarah couldn't just sit back and wait. She had to find the truth, and she was willing to go to any lengths to uncover it. Sarah wasn't a detective, she wasn't a seasoned investigator, but she was determined. She started digging into the city's old records, determined to find anything that might explain what happened to Jessie. She spent hours at the local library, poring over old maps, city blueprints, and any archived newspaper articles she could get her hands on. Her search led her to dusty shelves filled with stories about the city's history, stories that hadn't been told for decades, if not centuries. What she found was more disturbing than anything she could have imagined. It wasn't just about the tunnels. It was about the shadows that had once lurked beneath the city, waiting for their moment to strike. The more Sarah read, the more she realized that the tunnels were no mere relic of a forgotten time. They were something darker, something far more sinister than anyone had ever let on. The tunnels, Sarah learned, had been built long ago, long before the city became the bustling metropolis it was today. The city's early founders were part of a secret group, an organization known only as the Shadows. No one knew exactly when they had first appeared, or how far back their influence stretched, but the whispers about them were always the same. They ruled the city from the shadows. They were the ones pulling the strings, the ones controlling everything from behind closed doors. They were the ones who held the power, and they weren't afraid to use it. The shadows weren't just about wealth or political influence. Their true power lay in something much darker. Rituals, sacrifices, and secrets buried deep within the earth. They used the tunnels not just as escape routes, but as a place to perform their most sinister rituals. It was in these tunnels that they carried out their dark ceremonies, making sacrifices to ancient forces in exchange for power and control. Some believed that these rituals involved blood sacrifices, people who were dragged into the tunnels, never to be seen again. The victims were said to have been buried alive, left to scream in the darkness until their cries were silenced by the earth. The shadows never spoke of these rituals, and no one dared to question them. It was the price of power. Sarah couldn't believe what she was reading. It was like a nightmare, one that seemed too unbelievable to be true. But as she delved deeper, she realized that the stories had more substance than she'd ever imagined. Old records and letters from the city's early years mentioned the Shadows' influence, their control over the city's leaders, and the strange disappearances that occurred when their power was at its peak. Some of the city's founders had even hinted at the terrible things that took place in those tunnels. But the stories were always quickly dismissed, buried under layers of secrecy and fear. The deeper Sarah dug, the more she uncovered. There were accounts of strange symbols carved into the tunnel walls, symbols that had no known meaning. There were stories about people who had ventured into the tunnels and never returned, their bodies never found. And there were whispers about the screams that still echoed in the tunnels, even years after the shadows had vanished. The police, when they had investigated these old stories, had brushed them off as myths. Just stories passed down from generation to generation, they had said. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She knew something had happened to Jessie, something that tied her disappearance to the very tunnels that were now becoming infamous for their dark history. It wasn't just a random act. It couldn't be. Jessie hadn't just gotten lost. She hadn't just wandered into the wrong place. No, something had pulled her into those tunnels. Something had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many before her. Sarah's obsession with the case grew as the days passed. She couldn't stop thinking about the tunnels, about the horrors that lay hidden beneath the city's surface. Every night, she dreamt of Jessie, trapped in the darkness, screaming for help. And every day, she grew more and more certain that the key to finding her friend, finding out what really happened, lay in those tunnels. Sarah began visiting the tunnel entrances herself. She would go alone, walking in the quiet of the night, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Each time she entered the tunnels, she could feel the oppressive weight of the place. It wasn't just a maze of stone and dirt. It was something more. There was a malevolent energy in the air, a sense that the tunnels were alive, watching, waiting. Sarah felt as though she wasn't alone, though she never saw anything. Still, she pressed on. She had to know the truth. As the weeks passed, Sarah's search led her to a chilling discovery. She found old maps of the tunnels, maps that detailed hidden chambers and secret passageways that had long since been forgotten. Some of these chambers were marked with strange symbols. Symbols that matched the ones she had seen in the records about the shadows. These were the places where the rituals had taken place. where the sacrifices had been made. And Sarah realized with a sinking heart that Jessie's disappearance wasn't a coincidence. Jessie had wandered into one of these hidden chambers, and she had been taken, just like the others before her. The more Sarah learned, the more she realized how deep the darkness ran. The shadows had never truly disappeared. They had just gone underground, hiding in the city's deepest corners, waiting for the right moment to return. And now, with Jessie's disappearance, the darkness had risen once more. Sarah tried to tell the police what she had learned, but they didn't take her seriously. They had dismissed Jessie's disappearance as just another missing person case. They weren't ready to entertain the possibility that something far darker was at play. But Sarah knew better. She knew that Jessie had become a part of the legend, the next victim of the shadows, lost forever in the tunnels that had claimed so many before her. Sarah couldn't stop now. She couldn't give up on her friend, no matter how dangerous it became. The tunnels were still out there, waiting. And somewhere in the darkness, Jessie was still screaming, still calling out for help. Sarah was determined to find her, even if it meant confronting the terror that lurked beneath the city. She had already uncovered too much to turn back now. And so, with a newfound resolve, Sarah prepared to go deeper into the tunnels than ever before. She would face whatever horrors lay in the darkness, for she knew that the truth, no matter how terrifying, was the only thing that could bring Jessie and the others who had vanished back from the shadows. Sarah knew that if she was going to find Jessie, she couldn't do it alone. The search for her friend had become more than just a mission. It had become an obsession. The more she learned about the tunnels, the more she realized that this wasn't just about finding Jessie anymore. It was about uncovering the truth of what had happened beneath the city for so many years, and why the authorities and the city had kept its existence a secret. But the deeper she went into her investigation, the more she understood just how dangerous this journey would be. It didn't take long before Sarah found a small group of people willing to help her. These weren't experts, nor were they trained investigators. They were just a group of people, her closest friends, and a few daring strangers who were determined to help. Some were curious, some were brave, and some, to be honest, were simply crazy. But they all shared a single goal: to find Jessie and bring her back, no matter the cost. The night of the expedition arrived. It was just past midnight when they met, huddled at the edge of the city, where the tunnel entrances lay hidden behind an old, dilapidated building. The night air was thick, heavy with the kind of fog that rolled in from the coast, making everything feel distant and muffled. The moon hung high in the sky, barely visible through the cloud cover. The group stood together in the cold, each of them gripping a flashlight as their only weapon against the darkness. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. There was no turning back now. With a deep breath, Sarah stepped forward, leading the group toward the entrance. The walls of the tunnel loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. It felt like they were walking into the mouth of some great, ancient beast. As they crossed the threshold, the temperature immediately dropped. The cold seemed to seep into their bones, making the air feel denser with each breath. It wasn't just the cold that unsettled Sarah. It was the feeling of being watched. The gnawing sensation that something or someone was lurking just out of sight. She pushed the thought aside. They had a job to do. A group pressed on, walking deeper into the labyrinthine tunnels. The walls were damp, slick with moisture, and the ground was uneven, making it difficult to keep their footing. Every now and then, Sarah would glance back at the others. They were all visibly nervous, their faces pale as they tried to keep their composure. They whispered to each other, trying to reassure themselves, but no one spoke too loudly. No one wanted to disturb the oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air. As they ventured further, the air grew thicker. It wasn't just the cold. It was something else, something that made it hard to breathe. It was as though the tunnels themselves were alive, their very walls pressing in on them. The deeper they went, the heavier the atmosphere became. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest, and her nerves were on edge. She couldn't. The group walked for what seemed like hours, the faint echo of their footsteps, the only sound breaking the silence. They stopped to rest briefly, shining their flashlights on the walls, trying to find any trace of Jessie. The further they went, the more unsettling the place became. The faint, rustling noises they had heard earlier seemed to grow louder, and Sarah couldn't help but feel like they were being followed. She tried to focus on the task at hand, but every shadow, every creaking sound made her pulse race. It was as if the tunnels themselves were alive, breathing in the dark, and they were nothing more than intruders in its domain. Then, suddenly, something changed. It started as a whisper, so faint that Sarah thought it was just the wind or her imagination. But as they moved forward, the sound grew louder, clearer. It wasn't the wind, it was voices, faint and distant, but unmistakable. The whispers sounded like they were coming from deeper within the tunnels. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There was no mistaking it. They weren't alone down here. The group froze, their flashlights flickering as they tried to make sense of what they were hearing. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint their source. Sarah's heart raced. The others were looking at her, their eyes wide with fear. But Sarah just motioned for them to keep moving. There was no turning back now. They had to find Jessie. They moved forward cautiously, trying to block out the whispers that were now growing louder and more distinct. The voices were low and unintelligible at first, but then they started to take shape. It sounded like one voice, but it was muffled, as if it was coming from behind a wall or a thick curtain of darkness. Sarah's fingers tightened around her flashlight as she pushed ahead, her eyes scanning the tunnel in front of her. Then, without warning, the whispers stopped. A cold chill ran down Sarah's spine, and for a moment, she thought she had imagined it all. The tunnel was completely silent now, the stillness oppressive. But then, just as suddenly as the whispers had stopped, they were replaced by something much worse. Screams. The screams were unmistakable, raw and desperate. They echoed through the tunnel, bouncing off the walls in a way that made Sarah's stomach drop. The sound was so intense, so full of anguish, that it made her blood run cold. It was Jessie. It had to be. The screams were coming from deeper within the tunnels, and Sarah could feel the panic rising in her chest. Her legs felt like lead, but she pushed herself forward, her flashlight shaking in her hand. Her heart was pounding in her ears as she led the group toward the source of the screams. They were so close now. The sound was deafening, echoing in their ears, each scream more frantic than the last. Sarah could hear her own breath, quick and shallow, as she pushed forward, determined to reach her friend. The others were behind her, their footsteps hurried but hesitant, as if they too were unsure of what they would find. As they rounded a corner in the tunnel, the screams suddenly stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. It was as if the sound had never existed, swallowed by the darkness. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The walls of the tunnel seemed to close in around them, the narrow passageway growing smaller with every step. She turned to look back at the group, but they were all staring at her, wide-eyed, their faces as pale as ghosts. "What happened?" one of them whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Sarah muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. She was scared now, scared of what they might find, scared of what might be waiting for them. The air grew thicker, colder as they stood there in the dark, unsure of what to do next. The tunnel stretched out in front of them, dark and silent, as though mocking them for their fear. For a moment, Sarah thought they were trapped. The walls felt like they were closing in on them, pressing them toward the center of the earth, and she had a sudden, overwhelming urge to turn back. But she couldn't. Not now. Not when they were so close. She stepped forward again. And the others followed. But with each step, it felt like the tunnel was shrinking, like they were being drawn deeper into its heart. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them, something more dangerous than anything they had faced so far. The silence felt heavier than any scream, and Sarah could feel it weighing on her soul. They moved deeper into the tunnels. The coldness, the darkness, and the silence pressing in around them. Each step taking them further into the unknown. The search for Jessie had only just begun, but the tunnel seemed to be pushing them towards something far worse than they could have ever imagined. They were lost. Sarah could feel it in her bones, the weight of it pressing down on her chest, tightening her lungs with every breath she took. The dark walls of the tunnel felt like they were closing in, narrowing with each step they took, deeper into the abyss. The ground was uneven, the air thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was deafening. Every footstep echoed in the stillness, each one louder than the last, amplifying their anxiety. They had been searching for hours, maybe more, with no sign of Jessie. No clues, no answers. They had followed the screaming voice they had heard earlier, but as soon as they thought they were getting closer, it vanished. Just like everything else down here. The deeper they went, the more lost they became. Not just physically, but emotionally. It was as though the tunnels had a power all their own, twisting and shifting, pulling them further away from the light and deeper into a realm they could never escape. But then, at the end of one narrow passageway, they saw him. At first, it was just a shape in the darkness, a silhouette standing motionless against the blackened wall, barely visible in the dim light of their flashlights. The man was tall, much taller than any of them, his form almost towering over them. He wore a tattered jacket, the fabric hanging off his frame, like a broken shell. They were black, too black, as though they had been swallowed by the darkness itself. His pupils seemed hollow, empty. The kind of eyes that made your skin crawl, that seemed to look straight through you, seeing parts of you that you never wanted anyone to see. His face was shrouded in shadow, but those eyes, those soulless pits of blackness, burned through the darkness like an unholy fire. For a moment, none of them moved. They stood there, frozen in place, unable to tear their eyes away from the figure standing just a few feet ahead of them. The air was thick with a strange, oppressive silence. The others in the group stood beside Sarah, equally paralyzed, their breath shallow and quick. They could all feel it, the danger that loomed ahead, pressing against them from all sides, suffocating them. The man in the shadows turned toward them slowly, his movement unnaturally deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. His smile stretched across his face, twisted and unnatural, like something you'd see in a nightmare. It wasn't a smile of warmth or recognition. It was something far darker, the kind of smile that made your stomach churn, that made you want to run for your life. "Looking for Jessie?" he whispered, his voice low and guttural. It was almost like a hiss, slithering through the air, curling into their minds like a poisonous thought. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Her throat felt dry, her breath caught in her chest. She wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't form. Her heart pounded violently in her chest, and for a moment, she felt like she might collapse under the weight of the terror she was feeling. The man's eyes were fixed on her now, his twisted smile never faltering. And then, before she could even process what was happening, the ground beneath them began to shake. At first, it was subtle, a slight tremor, like the rumbling of distant thunder. But then, it grew stronger, the very earth beneath their feet trembling violently. The tunnel walls groaned and creaked as though they were being pulled apart. The air grew thick with dust, and the faint sound of shifting rocks filled their ears. It felt like the tunnels themselves were alive, like they were waking up from a deep slumber, and they were angry. The others screamed, their panic rising in unison. They tried to move, to flee, but the ground beneath them continued to shake. The walls seemed to close in on them, narrowing with every passing second. The man in the shadows remained motionless, his smile still stretched across his face, as though he were enjoying every moment of their fear. And then, from the darkness, the killer lunged. It was impossible to describe. One moment, he was just standing there, and the next, he was upon them. It was like he was part of the tunnel itself, an extension of the darkness, emerging from it like a beast from the depths. His movements were impossibly fast, predatory, like something far older than human, something that didn't belong in this world. He grabbed one of Sarah's friends by the arm, yanking him into the darkness with terrifying strength. The man's hands were cold. Panic spread like wildfire. The group scattered in every direction, running blindly through the tunnels, their hearts racing, their bodies trembling. Sarah could barely see, the flashlight shaking violently in her hand, the beam flickering erratically. She heard the sounds of her friends calling out, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to fight the fear that gripped her chest, making it hard to breathe. She turned a corner, her legs burning, her body desperate to escape. Her mind was clouded with terror. The only thought that mattered was getting out, getting away from whatever nightmare had taken hold of them. But as she ran, she heard something, a sharp, guttural scream from behind. It wasn't one of her friends. It was the man. He was coming for them. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She pushed harder, running faster, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear the others behind her, but she dared not look back. Every instinct told her to run. Run and don't stop. She barely managed to keep her footing as the floor beneath her became uneven. But her feet kept moving, driven by the raw instinct to survive. She turned another corner and found herself facing another narrow passageway. She didn't stop, didn't think. She rushed forward, the sound of footsteps behind her growing louder, closer. She could feel the air grow heavier, thicker with each step. It was as though the tunnel itself was closing in on her, suffocating her. But in that moment, something snapped inside her. She twisted, using every ounce of strength she had left, and kicked out with everything she could muster. The hands loosened for a split second, and she used that brief moment to break free. She pushed herself forward, her legs burning, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't look back. She couldn't. With a final burst of energy, Sarah emerged from the tunnel, gasping for air, her body trembling from the exertion and fear. She stumbled into the night, the sound of the killer's footsteps fading behind her, swallowed by the darkness. She had escaped, but she knew, deep in her bones, that the killer was still there, still lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next victim. And as Sarah collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath, she realized one terrifying truth. The tunnels had never been just a place to hide. They were a prison. And the killer was free once again, ready to claim more souls. Sarah's escape from the tunnels felt like a dream, or perhaps, more accurately, a nightmare she was still trapped in. The night air, fresh and cool against her skin, should have been a relief, but all she could hear were the echoes of the screams, the endless, desperate cries of her friends, of Jessie, who was still somewhere down there. The darkness she had fled from seemed to follow her, clinging to her like a second skin. Even when she stepped out into the harsh light of day, the shadow of what she had witnessed hung over her, just out of reach, but always present. The killer was still down there, and as much as she tried to tell herself that she had escaped, the truth was much darker. No one believed her. Not really. The police had been quick to dismiss the story, treating it like any other missing person case. They chalked it up to the usual hiking accident. Or perhaps the group had gotten lost. A few days of searching, a few interviews, and then it was over. As far as the authorities were concerned, the people who had disappeared in the tunnels were just another part of the city's forgotten history. But Sarah knew better. She had seen the killer. She had felt his presence, the way the air thickened, the way the walls seemed to close in on them. She had heard his voice, that dark whisper, the twisted smile, and the chilling way he had moved in the shadows. The killer wasn't just a man. He was something darker, something older, something that had lurked in those tunnels for years, waiting for the next group of foolish souls to stumble upon him. Sarah had seen it in his eyes, the emptiness, the hunger, and she knew that he would never stop hunting. He was still out there, somewhere in the dark, biding his time. The tunnels were his domain. He owned them body and soul, and no one was safe. Not her. Not anyone. But how could she explain that to anyone? Who would believe her? Who would believe that there was something living in the darkness beneath San Diego? Something that had been there for centuries, long before the city had ever been built. How could she tell them about the whispers, the screams, the twisted man with eyes so black they could swallow the world whole? They would think she was crazy. They would think she had imagined it all. So she kept her silence, though it was a silence that ate at her from the inside out. Every night, as she lay in her bed, her mind would race. The memories of the tunnels would come flooding back. The cold, the darkness, the screams. She could still hear Jessie's voice, faint and distant, calling out for help. But it wasn't just Jessie. She could hear the others too, their desperate cries echoing in the walls of the tunnels, as though they were still trapped down there, still struggling to escape. And then, when Sarah walked through the streets of San Diego at night, she heard it. The faintest scream drifting up from below, from the depths of the earth. It was so quiet at first, barely audible above the hum of the city, but she knew it for what it was. It was the scream of someone who had gone too far, who had ventured too close to the darkness. It was the scream of someone who had become the killer's next victim. At first, Sarah thought she was imagining it, but the more she listened, the more she realized that it was real. The screams were always the same, faint, distant, as though they were coming from miles below. but always just within earshot. The sound would rise and fall like the tide, and Sarah knew that it wasn't just her mind playing tricks. The killer was still out there, still hunting, still waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander into his grasp. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the tunnels were calling her back. She would try to ignore it, try to go on with her life, but every time she passed the entrance to the tunnels, every time she walked through the streets of San Diego at night, she felt the pull. It was as if the tunnels were alive, as if they were waiting for her to come back. And maybe they were. Maybe they had always been waiting for her. The more she tried to push the thoughts away, the more they came back, until she couldn't escape them anymore. Jessie was still down there. She had to be. The killer wouldn't just let her go. And Sarah knew, deep in her soul, that Jessie was still screaming, still calling out for help, just as Sarah had heard when they were down there. She could still hear it, the faint sound of her friend's voice, growing weaker with every passing day. The killer was still there too. He was watching, waiting, his twisted smile lingering in the darkness, ready to claim his next victim. The tunnels were never meant to be found, never meant to be explored. They were a place of death, of fear, of endless suffering. And once you entered, once you crossed the threshold, there was no turning back. The darkness would claim you, just as it had claimed so many before. Sarah couldn't forget what she had seen. She couldn't forget the killer, the way he had moved so fluidly through the shadows, like a creature that didn't belong in this world. She couldn't forget the terror that had gripped her heart when he lunged at her friends, when they were dragged into the darkness, one by one. It was a terror she would never escape, a terror that would follow her for the rest of her life. And yet, despite the fear, despite the horror, there was a part of Sarah that knew the truth. She couldn't leave it behind. She couldn't let go. Jessie was still down there. And as long as the killer was free, as long as the tunnels remained, there would be others. Others who would be taken. Others who would be lost. The legend of San Diego's last scream would never die. The legend would continue, passed down from one person to the next, from one generation to the next. It would always be there, lurking beneath the city, a dark reminder of the horrors that lay hidden in the tunnels. Because some killers, no matter how hard you try to escape, are never meant to be caught. And some tunnels, no matter how much you want to forget them, will always be hungry for more. Sarah knew that now. And so, with a heavy heart, she walked through the streets of San Diego at night, listening to the faintest scream echoing up from below. She knew, deep down, that the killer was still down there, still waiting, still hunting. And Jessie, she was still somewhere in the darkness, lost to the tunnels forever. The only thing Sarah could do now was listen and remember. The screams would never stop. The legend would never end.